All right.
Go ahead and introduce myself. So I'm Kevin White from San Diego State University, and I'm currently teaching a learning design technology course, 525, Virtual Reality, Virtual Worlds, and the Future of Learning. And with me is Anna Queiroz, and she's going to be speaking with us from the VHIL Learning Lab at Stanford University. And so I'm going to go through a few questions from our students. And let's go ahead and start from the top here. And so one of the questions that we can start off with, what was one of your favorite projects that you worked on in the lab?
Yeah, so one project that we just finished right now is a project with middle school students, where we went to some schools here in Bay Area and we compared VR to desktop. And we evaluated how they would affect learning, self-efficacy, that's an effective aspect of learning, and pro-environmental attitude. And this project was really nice because we worked with hundreds of students from 6th grade to 8th grade, so middle school students. And we found that both groups, VR and desktop, they learned pretty well and a lot about the environment. So the piece was about marine environment and how the CO2 emissions is impacting it. So we found that both groups, they learned a lot. But when we talk about self-efficacy, that's our ability to learn, how we think that we are able to learn, that we are able to master a content. Students in VR, they showed that they increased their perception of self-efficacy more than participants in the desktop condition. And it was really interesting because we ran a second study with the same variables, the same stimuli, and we found again the same results. So that's one of my favorite ones.
Yeah, as a quick follow-up to that, I'm curious to hear, are there any particular types of assessments you see, whether used in K-12 or in higher ed, assessments that work well for testing to see what works well for VR? What are the best ways to assess?
Yeah, so we used multiple choice questions, and we used also open-ended questions for assessing learning. For assessing self-efficacy, we used validated questionnaires that we have, for example, Albert Bandura. He's a researcher here from Stanford that has been working on self-efficacy for more than 40 years. And especially for learning, we like to pair multiple choices with open-ended questions, because then we can have a more deep understanding of how much they really learned, they understood, how they can apply what they understood and learned. So that's usually how we do it.
Excellent. I had another question from a student that wanted to know if you have any recommendations for parents and early educators that are looking to get involved in VR. I know that you have a VR 101 publication that came out of the lab. Do you want to expand maybe on some of the things that you've seen as just kind of general precautions and rules for maybe younger students who are getting into VR for the first time in a classroom, and for teachers also?
Yeah, so we still don't know much, like the VR community, we still don't know much how VR affect kids. What we know from a past study in the lab is that kids, when they go into VR, like 6 years old kids, when they go to VR, they have a more strong memory of what happened, to the point that they can create like false memories about what they just experienced. So that's the only thing that we know, not more than that. So it's hard, to create like guidelines based on not having enough research about that. What we usually do, we try to work with kids more than 11 years old, like middle school and up. We do not work with kids on elementary schools or kindergarten schools, and we restrict the time. So for example, each of our experiences, they are at most 8-9 minutes long. So, and that's the time that they get in VR.
Yeah, I know that Dr. Bailenson references like kind of a 20-minute threshold for experiences as being kind of a marker of what you should aim for, keeping it under that 20-minute mark. What kinds of advances in technology do you foresee might be able to transform that into a longer learning experience? I know that I've spent some time in VR up to like 40 or 60 minutes, and it's definitely somewhat disoriented feeling afterwards. So what are changes in transformations we need to see with the technology in order for that to happen. Can you speak to that at all?
Yeah, so we know that when you read in VR, you read slower than when you read in a computer. For example, you get tired faster than using a computer. So that's why we recommend like 20 minutes most. But what we also know is that the devices, they are evolving, and technology is evolving so quickly that devices, they are lighter right now. Optics from the devices is improving. So the sense of, you don't get that much tired anymore, resolution is getting better. But we don't have a study that has these numbers precisely. So we are still sticking to the 20 minutes. In VR.
Okay, very good. So another question from a student, what are the best precautions for protecting VR in social environments? So I think what we're looking at here is, when we get into a space like, Second Life, or somewhere where people can troll and get in and kind of really mess with your environment. What are some safety precautions that can be taken to make sure that we keep our environment safe for students in K-12, as well as, even at higher education or training environments, to make sure that they're safe?
Yeah, so we don't have research exactly on that topic in the lab. And what we know from our relationship with, some of these platforms of social VR are that each of them have different policies against harassment and, to avoid any kind of disturbance in the VR environment. But what we always like to emphasize is, if you are feeling okay with that environment, that's fine. If you're not feeling okay, just remove the headset and stop it. You don't have to keep. And that's a secret that we have. Every time we have someone in the lab, we always tell them, like, if you're not feeling okay, just close your eyes and remove the headset, and that's good. And that's the magic of VR. You can stop that reality at any time.
Yeah. Okay. Have you considered using social interactions for like an AR project or anything like that to see how people with maybe autism spectrum disorder or other specific special education populations might experience that kind of technology? Have you guys been focusing in?
Yes. We don't have that research in the lab. And our AR research is more focused on social interaction with, typical development participants. But what I would suggest is, if you're thinking about working with people on the autism spectrum, I would try VR first.
Right.
And the reason about that is because VR blocks the real environment, and then you can put that participant in a controlled environment. And that's what we most need when we are talking about people on the autism spectrum. Like some disturbance from the environment, we can just block that using VR.
Right. Excellent. So I'm going to move down to, because we already kind of touched on the 20-second rule. With one campus class being moved to online, we have lots of students who are now experiencing for the first time classes that used to be immersive, but in a classroom environment, and now they're forced to move into a new environment since the COVID-19 outbreak. So I guess our students are wondering if you've seen any transformations with learning experiences on your campus, or if people have reached out to you to see how VR can maybe be applied. And do you think VR is a practical way to replace classrooms, or are there certain things that do work better in a classroom and maybe the classroom needs to remain as the cornerstone of education?
Yeah, so my opinion, I think that we still need classrooms as they are, the classes as they are, like face-to-face is incredible. And we would think about VR as a supplement, or AR as a supplement. So we always say that we will use VR in situations that, for example, would be dangerous for these students. So if they can experience something in VR that in real life would be dangerous, like, for example, a chemical experience, a chemical reaction, then we would use VR. Or if it's too expensive, so for example, we have the ocean acidification experience in the lab, where you can go to the under the sea and see the effects of acidification on ocean life. Bringing all the students to that environment at the Mediterranean, that is in a specific site where it happens, would be so expensive. So instead of only talking about it or showing pictures of it, they can experience it. then I
Right.
would pair, you know, the face-to-face discussions with a VR experience. And talking about the current situation that students are going to online distance education, would be great if we had more VR headsets with the students, because then we could for sure pair these experiences with the online learning. But so far, we know that just a few of them have headsets at home. So it's a little bit challenging at this moment. But I can see that on the next years, it's gonna change. And we see an increasing interest from schools to implement VR. So I think it's gonna change on the next years.
Right, right. Really interesting to see how that's going to unfold. Yeah, I know that SDSU experimented a little bit with doing a little bit of work in Second Life with students in a kind of virtual classroom experience. And I think overall the consensus was they're kind of replacing something that was a tried and true proven method of the classroom and using a less effective virtual environment that was kind of glitchy and didn't really work out perfectly as they had envisioned. So yeah, I think that's something we might see in our lifetime, but definitely not replacing the classroom just yet. All right, so one of the questions, a student looked at the example you had from examining racism in virtual reality, and I think that they wanted to maybe have you expand and elaborate a little bit on that. Specifically, they wanted to know if you had specific types of virtual spaces that you were using to test that kind of environment to set the tone for that.
Yeah, so this experience is called 1000 Cut, and this one was developed in collaboration of the VHIL Stanford with Brown Institute at Columbia University. And it's a really interesting experience because the development, they interviewed several participants, people of color, and asked them what situations that they faced during their lives that were, they felt they were being discriminated, but they were very subtle, you know, or it was not something that you could charge someone of what they were doing. So yeah, so they collected all this data, and then they selected some of these experiences to be represented in the VR experience. And then in this VR experience, you embody a kid, a 6-year-old kid of color, and then you go through several experiences since 6 years old up to 35 years old. So for example, at, you know, kindergarten, school, and after, you know, when you are going to play basketball or looking for a job, and then you experience how these people reported that they were treated once or more than that in their lives. And it's a very powerful experience.
Yeah, yeah, I imagine it would be. I saw in one of the videos they showed kind of setting that up where the person kind of drops below a mirror, I think, and then comes back up, and they've completely transferred now to a new avatar. And seeing that transfer can be a quite powerful experience, I guess.
So this one is one other experience.
Okay.
This one is the mirror. Yeah, the mirror experience. Yes.
Okay.
So it was I stepped before 1000 Cut. So from this experience that you are describing, where you are, you know, you can see an avatar of you, you select your avatar, and then when you turn or you just, you know, go down, when you come back and you see another person. So if you are, for example, if you're a person of color, you can see a white person over there. If you are, you know, a different race, a different gender, and yeah, and from that study, what was learned is that after embodying out for a while, someone different than you, from different race, different color, different age, you start to, you increase your empathy, your feeling that you are, you know, you start to identify yourself more with that character. So that was one step first. That gave the idea of, you know, creating 1000 Cut where you embody this kid.
Yeah. So it does seem like virtual reality really has a lot of potential for social transformation and kind of progressive movements like that. I think that's really powerful.
Yes.
All right. Well, I have a couple of additional questions I wanted to get to. So where do you see the most potential for VR? We see lots of use of it in STEM fields right now, and there are a couple of other cornerstones like a medical profession. Where else do you see lots of examples that are successful, or where should we maybe start to look for examples of VR emerging as a successful story in the world of technology?
Yeah, so when we talk about VR, there are always these 4 applications that we recommend VR, and it works for any field, not only education, but medical, as you said, training. So for example, situations that are dangerous in real life, for sure VR can help. So when you're training construction workers, you can train them in VR first. So they learn the basic skills and abilities before going to the field, for example. Mining, the same thing. How to react to dangerous situations, for example, shooting. If you want to train people for that, then using VR is more effective and is indicated for that. And situations also that would be counterproductive. For example, when you are training medical procedures, usually what is done is you have all these bodies in the anatomy lab, and then you start to train over there, but they are very expensive. And after you train once, that what we call the piece can't be used again. So if you want to train like the motor skills, the initial ones in VR, and then after you go to the lab, would be also very effective. Another thing would be, for example, situations that are expensive, as I mentioned, like having the whole class going to a field trip to the Mediterranean would be super expensive, or even impossible, depending on the place that they are from. And using VR would just bring that reality to them.
Yeah, excellent. In relation to AR and VR as kind of the 2 main parts of mixed reality that we're focusing on in this course, where do you see the major distinction between where AR has been successful or VR hasn't? So I guess where does AR stand alone as maybe the best option in certain fields or in certain use cases? Have you seen anywhere where AR really shines?
Mm-hmm. So it's interesting to understand the difference between them. So AR, you can add a layer of digital content to your real environment. In VR, you block your real environment and you immerse the user on a complete digital environment. So you need to think about when you need to learn something about the environment that you are, and then you would need more information about that, and it would help you to perform your task, for example. Then AR would be the best case. For example, at assembly lines, where workers, they need to, for example, how to assemble car piece or a car motor, and then they would need to know exactly where each piece goes and how to do that. With AR, they wouldn't need to go and look for a manual all the time, change their, and put their hands on the manual and try to find the information over there. The information would be displayed for them. The same on some medical procedures, where they can just have more information about the patients on their headsets, and they don't need to use their hands to touch the computer, the mouse, or something like that.
Right.
And VR is more, we indicate VR for cases where you actually don't need to be on that reality. You don't need the real environment at that moment. And you want to immerse the user in a complete different environment. So for example, the one about ocean acidification, where we can put anyone under the sea, or embodying someone else, if you want to talk about discrimination and empathy. So those, I would go for VR.
Gotcha. Yeah, it seems like I've seen a number of studies that have echoed kind of the same thing, that procedures and kind of mechanical engineering and fields where you have assembly lines and things like that seem to be really popular with AR, but somewhere where you can really replace the entire environment would work better for VR.
Yes, and you can always pair both of them.
Right.
Like you can have a pre-training in VR of, simulations, different situations, and then after you go to the real environment using an AR headset to give you more information.
Yeah, I think one of the key takeaways is to understand that it's about what you want to display and what you want to experience in the real world environment, And a lot of people mistake AR for being a watered down version of VR, and that's really not what it's about.
No.
Yeah, so thank you for speaking to that and sharing some of those examples.
Yeah.
I do have a question. I'll finish up quickly here, just maybe one more follow-up after this. But I wanted to hear maybe how does your lab generate concepts for these types of huge research projects that you're doing? Is there a process, like a design process that your lab goes through? Do you just kind of sit around and discuss, or is this something that do you have a tried and true proven method of like providing these amazing experiences that you get to share with the world?
So we discuss a lot. We always look for experts on that field. So to give you an example, to develop the 1000 cut. So we have this partnership with the Brown Institute from Columbia University, and the best experts on the topic were into that project, discussing how they could best develop the experience. So always before developing an experience, we always go deep on the literature to know what we know about it, what the field knows about it. We look for the best experts on that field as well. So for example, the Stanford ocean acidification experience took more than a year to be ready, because there were several iterations working in collaboration with the Stanford Center for Ocean Solutions, with marine biologists, to be sure that the science over there is accurate. So it's always a long and deep process where we have, a lot of discussions. We look for precise information and experts on the topic to improve what we are doing.
Yeah, it seems like you always have some really innovative ideas. So it's great to see what you guys are always coming up with. It's keeping me on my toes. So like that. So I have students who are going to be working on developing virtual experiences and co-spaces for either education or training. So it could be on any end of that spectrum. Do you have any advice for how to develop VR experiences that are immersive when we're using kind of limited tools? So we're going to be developing co-spaces, which is really a K-12 development tool. It's not quite high resolution. It's kind of like a lot of people describe it as being kind of cartoonish, but you can still upload real, and you can upload CAD files and things like that to it. So what advice do you have for trying to create immersion with kind of limited tools for a class like mine?
Yeah, so realism is not always the most important thing. What's really important is that the latency to be low, like you need to have a refresh rate at least 60 hertz, because you don't want people to feel, motion sickness. It helps, to increase their well-being while using VR, for example. The other thing is that the experience needs to be pilot tested several times, and it helps a lot. So you just, you develop the experience, you put people to go through it, and then you learn from them what they thought the experience was about, how much they learned, how they felt about it, if it was interactive enough, if they felt the learning goals that you have with that experiences are being achieved with that. So that's something that we always do several times, like we pilot test with a lot of participants.
Yeah, you have to test to make sure you're getting the outcomes you want. Yeah. So getting lots of feedback from friends, family members, and other students was probably recommended.
Yes, and particularly with people that are not from VR field, it's very important.
Right. Yeah, I don't know how many times I've had students in my K-12 classes develop something in co-spaces, and they'll ask me after I'm done, "Did you see this?" And I'll explain to them, "Actually, I didn't see anything pointing to that. I never got to it." So you have to make sure those are flagged and that people have a way of actually encountering those elements of the experience and that functionality. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you so much for this interview. And I know that my students really enjoyed the book so far. I've had a great time with it, and thank you for doing the great work that you were doing. And thank you, Bailenson, for connecting me with the lab. So very much appreciated from SDSU.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here and talking a little bit about our work in VR and AR. And thank you so much. I hope the students they enjoy what they have just saw in the interview. And please let me know if you have more questions. We are really open to answer whatever you want to ask us.
Great, and I'll make sure I share a link with you. I'll probably end up throwing this up on YouTube and maybe a couple other places. So.
Okay, great. Thank you.